Hello and welcome to the 3D Blu-ray Bunker. This is a place for us die-hard fans of 3D where I look exclusively at 3D Blu-rays, not to do a movie review, but to focus almost entirely on the film's 3D, with maybe just a short word at the end about the film itself. And this time I'm looking at the 2015 film Mad Max Fury Road. It's got an aspect ratio of 2.39 to 1 and it was post-converted into 3D. And whilst this is a post-conversion, the film's director George Miller had initially intended to shoot it in 3D. Well, maybe not initially, as production plans began a decade or two before it eventually got made, but at some point during pre-production there was quite extensive planning to shoot it natively, and I think that remains very visible in the finished film. This is a great conversion done by Stereo D, with good 3D attention given to pretty much everything on screen, and the star of the film gets some really nice 3D treatment, that's to say the vehicles. Well, it's either the vehicles or Charlize Theron who can be seen as the stars, but probably not Tom Hardy. So the vehicles are not just given plenty of volume, but their design gives them lots of bits to stand out in 3D. Not just these wheels full of volume and texture, but it's all the other stuff bolted on that makes them look so good, like long bonnets on trucks and the big plough stuck on the front. This is a really solid and strong view here. Same goes for the exposed wheels on this long bonneted hot rod, and maybe this is one of the more ordinary looking vehicles in the film. Other bits jutting out and looking great in 3D include superchargers, if that's what these things poking out of the bonnet are. I don't really know anything about cars, but it's always a fine moment in a film when the driver realises that he can hit that red button in the car to spin that thing on the bonnet around to gain a bit more speed. Maybe the boldest 3D vehicle add-on are all these pipes up front. I don't know what these are, air intakes, which come right out and up close. All of the vehicles in the film definitely stake their claim to 3D space. Perhaps one of them doesn't do it quite as successfully, and it's this spiky armadillo car, where I think some of those blades sometimes trip up the conversion a little bit, as there were perhaps too many of them to separate out into correct space. The opening shot of the film gives us a great view of Max's car looking very three-dimensional. It's also a really nice shot as the camera drops down to reveal a rock in the foreground with the little fella on it blissfully unaware of the fact that he's living in a time of chaos and ruined dreams. Or at least he was, because in the next shot, the first close shot of Max, we find out that either Max was really hungry or the little lizard was some sort of wasteland delicacy. Either way, this shot is very solid looking, with Max's hair sticking way further out from his head than you'd expect in 2D. We see Max hanging around a few times, like from these bars, which work very nicely in 3D, or way up here in a shot that looks to me like it would have benefited from a top-down view to emphasise the peril in a shot that's a 3D classic, but unfortunately we don't get that view. He's also in a cage here, which is a lovely bit of composition for 3D, and it looks strong and solid. There are loads of shots like this where the composition is so well suited to 3D, like the counterbalance stuff on the chains in this contraption, hanging nicely in 3D space. Lots of shots with good foreground, middle ground and background look great, like the Warboys characters here. There are deep corridors that the camera moves through, always a good space for 3D. And there's a really nice version of the Beyond the Doorway view here, where the camera moves all the way onto the person in the distance in an excellent bit of 3D. Something that Miller does in this film that he did in his previous Mad Max movies is the frame dropping thing, which sort of speeds up the action a little bit sometimes, but I do think it draws attention to itself a bit, and it makes it look maybe a little bit cheap, although I'd take that form of cheap looking over the other end of the scale, high frame rate, all day, any day. I think my favourite bit of 3D design and composition in the film works in 3D more than one way. It's an extremely atypical shot, full of these rows of lush green plants stretching into the screen, and the chains hang down all over the Z-axis. It's an excellent shot. A shot I always like in 3D films is when the camera is low to the ground and you get that view of the surface stretching deep into the screen. And this film's absolutely full of these views, sometimes static, sometimes at speed, always effective in 3D. There's an attempt at a bit of fun with breaking the frame a couple of times. So here the toes on his foot break the lower black border and stick out over it. It should be a fun thing to do, but I do think it's done a little bit clumsily here because the entire frame is shrunk to give them some foot to play with, so to speak. So not only is the lower black border much higher up than usual for the effect, but the sides of the frame are drawn in too. Also, it's extremely brief, lasting just a few frames. The same with the brand here. This shot lasts about 1 second, and this one's even less effective, I think, because where they draw down the border at the top and up at the bottom, it's quite dark, so you don't necessarily notice that the brand is breaking into a new false border, and even then, like the foot, it still breaks the frame anyway. So unfortunately, compared to the same technique in something like the young and prodigious T.S. Spivet, for example, where it was done elegantly and excellently, this might be the least impressive example of 3D false border frame breaking that I've seen. Something the film does very well is with its 3D particles. Here are things like water, where each droplet is placed into its own 3D space, and it's all done so well that I do wonder if maybe the water here has been digitally augmented, and the same goes for various sparks in the film, where it feels like every single little bright flash is in a different 3D space. This debris blasts out too. This is great 3D, and especially so for a conversion. So most of the time the 3D is done very well, and it's very noticeable. Not always though, like in this attack sequence it goes relatively flat for a few moments, but I think that might have been done intentionally so that when it cuts to a load of debris being hurled at the camera, the 3D is dialed back up again for extra effect. So it's like the 3D equivalent of hitting that supercharger button. The inside of cars is always quite atmospheric, with the 3D giving a very good feel for the cockpits with their switches, gear levers and general feeling of makeshift retrofitting and grime. Windscreens are all grubby, which is always good from a 3D point of view for creating a feeling of depth beyond or within. And better than dirt is bullet marks like these, all looking very good and so much more interesting for 3D than a clean windshield would. If you're looking for pop-out moments, this film has plenty. There's the odd body flung out, but typically in ultra-brief shots. Also things like harpoons fire out, but again they only spare a few frames for these things, so I don't think it's exactly top-quality pop-out action. There are plenty of the ever-reliable poking guns. I've said it before, but this must be by far the most used negative parallax shot in the history of 3D cinema, and these all look perfectly good. Lots of films do the gun shot with a shallow depth of field, often with the gun being the thing out of focus, but here the depth of field I think always keeps the gun and the person holding it in focus, so very sensible for good 3D. The film does have one moment of pop-out which is so good, and it's a sort of double pop, one thing then another. It comes at the climax of the film, although this isn't really a spoiler. And it's interesting seeing it here in 2D, because I think like this, you don't immediately understand the shape, or maybe even exactly what it is. Again, there's loads of depth of field in the focus, so it merges with the background in 2D. But in 3D, this is an absolutely awesome moment in slow motion. It's a real 3D thrill, as well as being quite funny and acting as a full stop to the action prior to the film's coda. There's a shot where it might first look like some distant dunes, possibly not actually, as you can already sort of detect an arm on the right of the screen there, which in 2D might take a few moments for that to register, but in 3D maybe that visual gag, if it was a visual gag, doesn't really work because the 3D makes the scale immediately apparent. So possibly if the 3D had been very weak here, it might actually have been a more effective shot. I expect there are things in films and in life itself that irritate you, which most other people think are irrelevant. And for me, ever since I was a kid, I've been overly obsessed with how the view through binoculars is shown incorrectly in films, almost always being the nonsensical horizontal figure of 8. So this looks good, just the single circle that it should be, except that's because these binoculars only have one lens. So it looked like they got it right, but maybe that was just another visual gag. Although then again, later on, there are some healthy looking binocular viewers, and the view through these is still just the correct single circle, so that's great from my point of view, except the viewers, like most binoculars, have a wide interocular, so the shot should have actually had more depth to it than it does. Still, like I said, I know no one else cares about this. The stars you can see here are obviously just a 2D backdrop, as you'd expect, but I'm pretty sure that the constellation on the left there is Cassiopeia, which wouldn't be a coincidence, as in Greek mythology she was a beautiful queen, which is in keeping with one of the story's main themes, the liberation of the bad guys' 5 reluctant beautiful queens. So that's a nice little touch, even if it is a flat backdrop. In one of the moments that's straight out of Mad Max 2, there's an unwilling human figurehead, in this case Max, stuck up front and in strong 3D space, and it acts as a nice callback to that ancient film. And there's another shot that George Miller has used in previous Mad Max films, and that's the split-second bulging eyes shot, so it's nice to see it done here in 3D, even if it is a blink-and-you'll-miss-it shot, which is slightly ironic, as this guy's days of blinking look to be over, or maybe he's just had a bad 3D experience. So just a very quick word about the film itself. When I was sitting in a flea pit cinema in the early 1980s watching Mad Max 2, transfixed by what the young me was immediately starting to think of as one of the greatest films ever made, if you told me back then that one day a sequel to this would be nominated for 10 Oscars, including Best Film and Best Director, I think I would have maybe wondered if the world had gone through some kind of apocalypse as per the film. And Fury Road was a fairly unusually huge hit with both critics and audiences, albeit maybe not so huge at the box office. It's an action film for sure, but it's not really like the majority of action films. This is pure cinema, the film story being told almost entirely through its visuals. There's barely any exposition, not really a great deal of dialogue at all, although there is still story and character and emotion within all that. And if you're going to tell a story visually, then having incredible visuals helps, and the ones on show here are pretty much non-stop stunning. Colourful and beautifully photographed. The locations are fantastic, the design of the vehicles and every other prop is great, and the characters all have a memorable look to them, from Immortan Joe, the War Boys, the Brides and Furiosa. It's maybe only old Max himself who looks relatively ordinary. The action, I think, is mostly, if not entirely, old-school practical filmmaking with stuntmen doing their thing rather than CG, and it's also close to non-stop, with the film being pretty much just one long extended chase. With a fair bit of variety in how the chase and attacks take place, although in terms of driving it's not really classic racing, as it's mostly just driving in a straight line. So incredible looking, furious action, superb design, great sound. I just wish I loved this film as much as everyone else seems to. I've tried to like it, but for me, ultimately it doesn't have that extra special heart and soul that Mad Max 2 had. This could well be totally unfair, but I do wonder whether Byron Kennedy, who was George Miller's producer until his tragically early death soon after the second film, was a bit like Gary Kurtz was to George Lucas with his contribution to Star Wars, what with the dropping quality of the third films in those two series after those guys were no longer around. I don't know what either of those two producers brought to the story, but I'm pretty sure that both series benefited from their presence and were weaker without it. And I'm still not 100% sure on whether this is a sequel, a reboot, or a bit of both. Anyway, I do understand why there's been so much love for the film, and I'm on board with a lot of it, but the things I don't love about it are basically the absence of any interesting dialogue scenes, and what for me was ultimately a surfeit of action, and maybe worst of all, what I thought of as an unengaging and charisma-free performance from Tom Hardy in what felt like, unexpectedly really, just a supporting role. One thing that most of the critics didn't really praise it for was the 3D, but along with every other 3D fan who's seen it, I'm very happy to voice my support on how good it is. So I hope you found this in some way useful, and if so, I hope you will join me again soon for another 3D Blu-ray review. Until then, thanks for looking in on this one, cheers for now, bye bye.